Hey, folks. Montana, Wisconsin, Colorado, Georgia, New York, Auburn, Maine. Hey, are you having a good day up there today? We're having a great day down here on the water, but um, the bugs, oh my heavens, the bugs have hit. So, I'm supposed to go for a walk later on with a friend, and I just said, you sure about the bugs? New Jersey, Ithaca, Western Mass, Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Isn't this cool that we all come together from all over the country? There's so much that can be said about social media that is not good. But it's also just incredibly cool that we can do this from all over the country and all over the world, just by clicking a button. So all right, let me jump into, these new shorter format. Apparently people really like the shorter format, but it does mean that I want to get on stuff more quickly. So let me jump in here with the big news, I guess, today is the election by the College of the Cardinals of a new pope. And the new pope was born in Chicago, and he did a lot of his work in Peru, where he became a citizen in 2015. And let me just tell you a little bit briefly, in case you're interested, about how one picks a pope. It's the pope is elected by the College of Cardinals, and this is a piece that I think is really interesting. The College of Cardinals is made up of cardinals who were not yet 80 years old on the day that the previous pope died. I do not know the history of the papacy at all, but boy, that's an interesting little tidbit, isn't it? I'd love to know how they came up with that. Anyway, so they have elected this man whose last name is Prevost, Robert Prevost, and who will take the name Pope Leo the something. I'm sorry, I don't remember which one. And the people have asked what that means in the United States. And I want to be very clear. I am not a scholar of Catholicism. Or of other countries. I am a scholar of American politics. And so my approach to this is about American politics. And in that sense, it's a really interesting choice. And let me tell you why. It's an interesting choice because Prevost was a supporter of the previous pope, Pope Francis. And Pope Francis was a pope who was really working to modernize the church's social message. He was a Jesuit. The last pope was a Jesuit, and very into the ideas of the Jesuits, the idea of protecting the marginalized, and so on. And the Prevost Leo now is in that mold, but he's really interesting because the U.S. Catholic Church has a real deep rift in it. And it's a rift between those who followed Pope Francis quite willingly and those who are much more radical and are trying to use the traditionalist teachings of the Catholic Church to enforce right-wing politics, to say, we can't have abortion, women should be in the home, and so on. And the leaders of that are the ones who are the leaders of MAGA. So J.D. Vance, who is a convert to Catholicism, is part of that right-wing Catholic branch. And so many of the people in the so many Catholics in the MAGA community are part of that right-wing branch. So one of the ones who jumps to mind is Tom Holman, who is Trump's czar for the border, is very proud of his Catholic heritage, and he basically picked a fight with Pope Francis earlier on this year. So the big fight, of course, is over right-wing politics and the United States government's treatment of migrants as criminals. Pope Francis said, it's okay to say that you're going to protect your borders, but you can't criminalize these people, just deport them. And that's paraphrased, by the way. It's a letter to the American bishops that he published on February 10th. After J.D. Vance tried to use Catholic teachings to justify the administration's approach to deportations, or now it turns out to be renditions. But so for the College of Cardinals to choose a man in the mold of Francis, they have some doctrinal differences, but to choose a man like that, is a declaration that they are not embracing the right-wing radical Catholicism that has been rising around the world, but it exercises such power in the United States. And that is likely, the fact he is an American or was born in the United States of America is likely a sign that they are trying to heal that rift in the United States and to try and bring the influence of the Catholic teachings onto those who are using it in what somebody like Pope Francis or now Pope Leo would consider quite radical and inappropriate ways. So that's a really interesting choice. And you're not probably going to hear a lot more from me about the Pope going forward because it's just not my turf. I can't, I just can't do that. But in addition to that, um, there's something else very interesting about that particular election. And again, speaking, I don't know what goes on through a cardinal's mind, so I cannot speak for them. But it seems to me, as an observer of American politics, that a really interesting development in the last 3 months has been that before Donald Trump took office in the United States of America, many countries were flirting with right-wing authoritarianism. Those parties were rising. They were increasingly powerful, and they were kind of being able to attract voters with, if you will, a wink and a nod. Oh, we're not really going to do that. Oh, that's not really what's going to happen. And with the ascension of Donald Trump and J.D. Vance to the White House, what you are seeing is that wink and a nod is suddenly people are actually seeing what it means to play footsie with authoritarianism. And they're watching the attacks on the United States. And all of a sudden, those right-wing authoritarian movements are falling apart. And it happened quite dramatically in Germany when the AfD in Germany, the Alternative for Germany, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, they did not do as well in the election that J.D. Vance and Elon Musk tried to put real pressure on them to succeed in. Then, of course, we get the election of Mark Carney in Canada, and Carney was not projected to win before Trump took office. And then, of course, he won quite handily. And now we also have the Vatican coming out and saying we are not going to go down the road of right-wing authoritarianism. And that's actually quite interesting coming from the Pope or coming from the College of Cardinals, because there was a strand in the United States. I'm sorry, I don't do Catholic history, but I do American history, and there's lots of Catholics in America. There is a strand of Catholicism in 20th century America that takes such a strong stand against communism that they end up embracing fascism. And they become really, it's a kind of a flash moment, and they become really instrumental in, for example, Joe McCarthy's tenure as the person who's trying to destroy communism in the United States. And they do break, the mainstream American Catholics do break from that. But there is this important moment when Catholics, at least in the United States, flirt with fascism. If you're interested in that, there is a book by a friend of mine, as well as a colleague, called The Nazis in Copley Square. And it is a story of the rise of Nazism and the role that Catholicism played in that. The person's name is Charles Gallagher, Father Charles Gallagher. And it's a really interesting book. So obviously the church has looked at this and said, we're not doing that again. We're going to push the other way. So that's it's an interesting and an important statement, I think, as well. All right. So that had to be done there. But now I'm going to answer some of your questions about what's going on in this moment. Let's start with the material I talked about last night in the letters from an American. It was quite long. Sorry about that, but I wanted to make quite a clear record of it because it sounds like tinfoil hat stuff. And honestly, I think it is tinfoil hat stuff, except that it's got the power of the U.S. government behind it now. So ideas that in the past would not have even gotten a hearing are now suddenly have the power of the government behind them. And one of the things in that I talked about was the fact that Musk's so-called Department of Government Efficiency, which once again is not an official agency, has been collecting Americans' data. And they're collecting data in order to create a master database, which they have suggested could be used for things like well, what they keep talking about is waste, fraud, and abuse, with the idea that they're finding, as you may remember seeing in the news, Social Security that was going to children, for example, which they thought was waste, fraud, and abuse. It turns out it was children who are getting benefits because their parents have died. But if you remember, they also talked about people who were collecting Social Security checks, and they were 150, and that was, they just simply didn't understand how to read the COBOL information when they said that. So they've talked about it being about waste, fraud, and abuse, but they have also talked about pulling these databases together to target undocumented immigrants, which caused a huge stink a few weeks ago when the IRS said that they would give access to their files to the Department of Government Efficiency agents, because the IRS has always told undocumented immigrants that they would not turn that material over, and that one of the ways to make it clear that they were eager to become good American citizens was to pay their taxes. So this was reneging on a promise that they had given in the past. So they've talked about using that master database in those two ways, but you are starting to see people like Department of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., saying he is going to find the causes of autism, which, by the way, have been studied for many years now by actual scientists. He's neither a doctor nor a scientist. He says he's going to find the causes himself very quickly by looking at a combination of insurance data, medical records, and the information from people's watches, that their health information. Now, of course, that's information that previously was siloed, so the government could not create master databases the way that authoritarian governments like China do. But you can see that they're trying to think about using this in different ways. That's a real problem. That's something to be very concerned about. There are laws against the use of our data that way. There's the Privacy Act of 1974 that says you have to have very strict controls over who has access to Americans' data. And those have not been honored. There are now more than 11 lawsuits against the Department of Government Efficiency and the administration for the misuse of our data. But that's something to be very concerned about. Somebody asked if it's possible to get that data back now that it has been taken. No, I don't think you can get the data back. You certainly can be careful about how it's used. But also remember that we don't know that that data has been fully compromised. And there have certainly been a lot of places where judges have said, no, you can't go get that data. So it's not clear yet what stage we're at, but that should definitely be on people's radar screens. And it's been on my radar screen since the beginning, simply because it was clear to me that when Musk appeared with people who were trying to access data, they weren't auditing. They weren't, and when they got rid of the inspectors general, for example, who do audits, or when they never talked about the fact the government actually has quite an effective department, the General Accountability Office, that always monitors for waste, fraud, and abuse, that in fact they were up to something else. And it appears that that's what they are up to. Now, the other thing I wrote about was the ways in which the administration is pushing Starlink. Starlink is a subsidiary of Elon Musk's SpaceX. SpaceX is that space exploration company that keeps trying to send rockets up to perfect the technology of rockets, eventually to get rockets that can go to Mars, because Elon Musk believes that he needs to settle Mars in order to save humanity. He has talked about, and he talked this week on the Fox News channel about how he's trying to save humanity from the explosion of the sun, or the expansion of the sun. I think that's a bit of a smokescreen. The sun is not going to expand to threaten the Earth for about 5 billion years, which is, not on my time horizon. But in fact, Musk has a much more thought out, longer argument about why he feels it's time to do interplanetary travel. But I don't think it was one he felt he could explain on the Fox News channel, so he didn't. But the reason that matters is because there is, behind this push to get to Mars, there is a vision of human society that is a rejection of the world that we have lived in for 400 years, the idea of countries and nation states that have their own laws and protect the people within them. People like Elon Musk and the tech guru Curtis Yarvin and Peter Thiel, who's the guy who invented PayPal, also a billionaire. Those tech oligarchs have a vision of society in which it is decentralized. There are not state governments, that is, country governments, but that there are people grouped according to technological groupings, technological states or city states, if you will, that are overseen by but not by a democracy, but usually by some kind of an authoritarian leader. And I think you can imagine who they see as being that authoritarian leader. So when you think about SpaceX and Starlink, you have to realize there's this larger argument going on behind them. But the administration has put a lot of weight behind SpaceX, and which is developing these rockets. It has just recently put forward a budget that called for cutting about 25% of the budget that currently goes to NASA, but taking about $1 billion of the money that's left and giving it to SpaceX to go to Mars, or giving it to projects that are designed to go to Mars. One assumes that means SpaceX. And then the administration has also put a lot of weight behind Starlink. And Starlink, as I say, is this company that produces the satellites that manage the world's communication, or could manage the world's communication. And it has put weight behind them to the degree that Trump has halted or paused the expansion of rural broadband that went into place under President Joe Biden, clearly with the idea of turning, instead of developing rural broadband, simply having rural areas use Starlink. As many of my neighbors here do. You know that I'm in somebody else's place because I don't have enough internet at my house in the woods to be able to do these kind of broadcasts. But in addition, two reporters from the Washington Post said yesterday that in order for countries to come to Trump to talk about future trade policies, the administration has made it very clear, the State Department has made it very clear that they consider it an act of goodwill to approve permits for Elon Musk's Starlink to manage the communications for that country. And India has fast-tracked its permissions to make that happen. Just 1% of India's commercial broadband would pay about $1 billion a year. So this is not little potatoes here, but even more important than that is that putting Elon Musk in charge of the world's communications makes him extraordinarily powerful. And the State Department has said, well, we don't want China to do it because that's the big competitor. And it seems to me there is a middle ground. I agree, you don't want any country to monopolize the communications around the world, simply because if you wanted to, for example, as Elon Musk threatened to do, if you wanted to hurt one side or another in a war, you could simply stop providing cell coverage for whichever side you don't like, which is something that Musk has threatened to do. And Europe has responded by saying, we will develop our own systems because we don't trust you. The problem is they're somewhat farther behind Musk's. But there's no reason that the United States government couldn't do that, except that they decided in 2015, I think it was maybe 2016, that it was better to go with Musk than it was to spend the money to do it through the government. And that, it seems to me, is an answer to, well, we don't want China to do it. I would say we also don't want a billionaire, the richest man in the world, to do it. We want to do it in a way that we have some control over who has access to that material. Anyway, so those were the two things you asked about. Somebody also asked me to explain crypto. I did that on Tuesday, and I did it pretty thoroughly on Tuesday. So you can go back and look at that video. But now let's take a look at some of the other questions that you asked and some that you didn't. So one of the things that I don't think we're talking about enough in this country is that Trump does not appear to be in control of his administration. And as proof of that, I will refer not only to the quotations from him. If you listen to him, he is incoherent. He can't put together a sentence. But he did not, for example, seem to have any idea about the history or the dangers of the increasing tensions between Pakistan and India. And he has repeatedly said to people he doesn't know what's going on. He said that he was not the person who agreed to the rendition flights of migrants from Venezuela to go to El Salvador back in early March. He said he didn't do that. His name is on it, but he said he didn't do it. He said, which again, I jumped all over and it just didn't get a lot of curiosity, but who's really behind that? Again, it seems to me that probably Stephen Miller, his White House Deputy Chief of Staff, and Kristi Noem, his Secretary of Homeland Security, are behind those. But the president should know what's going on. In the last couple of days, he has said that he does not, he was not the person who was behind who he didn't know anything about the attempt to render migrants from Asia to Libya. That he said you'd have to ask the Homeland Security Secretary about that. And he clearly has absolutely no idea how tariffs work. Just absolutely no idea. It's a little mind-boggling because he seems to think that the fact he has essentially destroyed our trade with China is a good thing, because he says that means we're not going to spend money on Chinese goods, so we'll keep the money here. That's has absolutely nothing to do with how the economy works. I mean, I suppose that's true in a sense, except what that means is that we're not going to get the goods that we normally purchase from China. And anybody who works in a related field is looking at significant issues with their jobs. So I'm starting here by saying that Trump is not in good control of this administration, which, as I said the other day, brings up the question of who is in control of the administration. And I would suggest to you that there's a struggle going on between the MAGAs, who are really pushing on the idea of deporting or rendering to other countries any undocumented migrants. And that would be, as I say, Stephen Miller in the White House and Kristi Noem at the Department of Homeland Security. But then there is also the people who are trying to institute Project 2025. And that effort is being led by Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget. And then there are the tech bros who, the Elon Musk crew, who is looking at decimating the United States government because they want to create this new kind of network states and want to be able to gather the power of communications, artificial intelligence that is fed by these databases that they're pulling, and also but through cryptocurrency, in order to get rid of the idea of nation states and replace it with this new technological idea. Just to be clear, I don't think that's going to happen. I personally, I am not a technology person, but I don't think that Musk is going to be sending people to Mars by 2029, which is what he is saying now. But I do think that these technologies and the monopolization of these technologies by a very few individuals who appear to be trying to destroy the United States is not a good thing, and that they're going to do a lot of damage before they're stopped or before their mission falls apart. So that's kind of my stand on that. So if Trump is not in control, and those people are, and there may be other people as well, I'm just watching from outside. A lot of you have asked, why can't he be impeached now? And the answer to that is a historic one, of course. And that's that when the framers wrote the Constitution, they did not expect the rise of political parties. If you read Federalist Number 10, which I'm sure all of you had to do in high school, and you're thinking, what is this crap? Because honestly, it's really hard to read. If you're sitting here thinking that like there's some magic switch and suddenly historians can do that stuff easily, that's actually not the case. It's very difficult to read. But what Federalist Number 10 talks about is it talks about how he's very concerned about the rise of what he calls factions, and he meant parties. They didn't really have words for parties then. And what he argued was that Madison argued in Federalist Number 10 was that we didn't really have to worry too much about the rise of political parties in the United States because the country was so big, and that people would not divide into groups of two, as had seemed to have plagued British politics before the creation of the United States of America. But they would kind of splinter. They would all sort of, a whole bunch of people would agree on one thing for one issue, but then they'd split up and agree in different ways for something else, and that you would never really get the overriding power of a political party. And in fact, that's not what happened. We got the rise of political parties by, the 1790s, really, and by 1800, they're starting to skew the system. That's when we get the winner take all idea of the Electoral College is in 1800, and then of course it's going to spread through the 1830s. But what this means is when they set up safeguards around the rise of what they would have called the demagogue in their time, they didn't think that members of Congress would put party above country. And that's what we've got going on right now with the Republican Party, or what is now actually the MAGA Party. In the past, the way the system was supposed to work was that Congress people would take a look at a president who was running amok, and regardless of party, would say, we are going to protect our Constitution, which is, of course, what they say an oath to when they get sworn into office. And this is something that Angus King of Maine, the senator from Maine, keeps hammering on: as you swore an oath, uphold your oath. But they instead, what we are seeing is a MAGA party that is refusing to turn against Trump, not, I think, because they like him or like what he's doing, although some of them do. They are eager to continue to court his base. And I'm going to speak about that in a little bit more in a second. But the reason it's not worth trying to impeach him now, although certainly somebody has brought it up, is because right now the Republicans control the House of Representatives. They are not going to impeach him currently. Now, their margin is very, very small. And the thing is, in the House of Representatives, an impeachment vote will not, he will be impeached. That's what that means. And an impeachment is not breaking the law. It doesn't have to be. It simply says you've committed high crimes and misdemeanors. And my great example of this is you could sit in the White House and just watch Bugs Bunny all day, and you could still be impeached because you're not actually doing your job. It's not against the law to watch Bugs Bunny. It's actually quite a good idea, but it's not doing your job. So you could be impeached for that, but then it goes to the Senate. And the Senate has to decide whether or not to convict the president under the charges of impeachment. And again, it's a Republican Senate, and they need more than a majority. They need, I think it's 60 votes to convict on articles of impeachment. And right now, those numbers simply are not there, which is why I put that where I did. Because again, I'm trying to keep these short now. This is why people's voices are so important, because what you are seeing right now in the polls and around the country is the collapse of Donald Trump's popularity, the extraordinary dislike of Elon Musk in the Department of Government Efficiency. And if you're watching closely, what that's translating to is a number of Republican Congress people, both in the House and in the Senate, saying they will not go along with the things that the Trump administration is trying to do. And that pressure, I mean, so we're only 3 months into this administration. Continuing that pressure and to articulate what you actually care about, what you want to see done, is going to be increasingly important, because one of the things that I keep trying to emphasize is that politics is a moving target. So, when coming out of the box on January 20th, Trump and his people insisted he had a mandate and this was what popular and this is what people wanted. You're not hearing that anymore, are you? What you're hearing is them saying, well, this is what voters voted for. Well, no, we didn't. I mean, even if you're a Trump voter, you didn't think you were voting for the things that are now happening. Because if you remember, Trump promised different things to different constituencies. And so you could sort of a la carte it. I like that he's going to bring prices down, but oh no, he's not really going to deport my neighbor who's been in this country for 30 years. And now, of course, you're getting just the opposite of that. So in this moment, it's not a time in which impeachment is going to happen, but the place that people can make a real difference is continuing those phone calls, continuing to be in the street, continuing to run for office, continuing to show up to school board meetings and to town offices and to state offices, and making it very clear that this is not what you were hoping to get out of this administration. Let me see there. I think there was one more thing. Oh, and that was the final question. And that's a good place for me to end it. Is somebody asked, what increases voter turnout? turnout. And there's two answers to that. The first is pressure to increase access to the vote, because what we have seen since 1986 is voter suppression. And you see it in places like Texas and Pennsylvania and Florida and North Carolina. And you can tell, you don't need me to do this, and you don't need any fancy polls or anything else to tell this. You can tell when voter suppression is happening because the people in charge of the state start to take away drop boxes. They start to cut down on the hours of voting. They start to ask for new kinds of voter ID. If they are doing that, that says they don't want a lot of people to vote, because they know if a lot of people vote, they're going to lose. So when people talk about Texas or Florida as being red states, my answer is always they are voter suppression states. And you know that because Texas keeps taking away drop boxes. All right. So one of the things, pressure points here, is to demand that we get access to the vote, and also an end to gerrymandering, because that's another place that our votes are really being suppressed. So that's one answer. But the second answer is the one that is a daily project for people like me, and I think for a lot of you. In the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1930s, and now again in the present, people start to show up to vote when they understand that the government is not working on their behalf, and they can object to that, but also see an opportunity for a different kind of government. And it's really quite dramatic in the 1850s and quite dramatic again in the 1890s. That when people start to believe that democracy is under attack and that they are losing the principles that have made this country great, that's when they start to turn out. And the people who turned out for Abraham Lincoln were known as wide awakes. You might not have heard of them before. They were instrumental in getting people to turn out. They had picnics. They had picnics to go and be political, and they let ladies go. I'm not making that up. That's one of the reasons young men really turned out for the wide awakes, is they could go to picnics and meet ladies, meet girls. But you see this again in the 1890s, when you start to see labor organizations continuing to have bigger and bigger rallies and publishing pamphlets and publishing broadsides, and the farmers movement publishing newspapers to make people understand that the government was not working for them. And that's the enterprise in which people like me are now engaged. It's trying to tell people what the world is really like, what is really happening, and encourage them to speak up, and to speak up on the issues that they care about. Not that I am telling people to go vote the way I want you to vote, but my theory is, and it's the same theory that Abraham Lincoln worked with, and that people worked with in the late 19th century when they stood against the robber barons, and that people like Francis Perkins and Franklin Delano Roosevelt operated under. And that's that if people are truly informed, really, about what is happening in their society, they will make good decisions about it. And so that's what I'll leave you with today. My job, I think, and to the degree that you are willing to talk and to share information and to encourage people to understand what is real, that job is the one that will enable us to reinforce the guardrails of our democracy, and to get people who really care about a government that works for us to show up, to make their voices heard, and eventually to vote. So thank you for being here, and we got a lot more up our sleeve at this channel and coming from me in the next couple of weeks. Thanks for being here. So people are here. It's a little hard for me to tell at first whether or not you're here. Thank you for being here. And it's fun to see people coming in from Colorado and Missouri and Canada. I've been looking into some Canadian history lately. Danny, it's so lovely to see you. Fort Collins, Colorado. Well, maybe it's everybody's here from Colorado today. Nevada, Oregon, Durham, North Carolina. Oh, wow. Do you have a good bakery in Durham? You know, I should just stop doing what I'm doing and just talk about all the great bakeries around this country. Florida, Baltimore, historic city, Wisconsin. And now I've never heard of Tomball, Texas. That's kind of cool. All right. I'm in Framingham, right near me. I lived in Framingham for, I guess, about a year with my college roommate. It's a great town. All right. So I'm going to get right into the material that you asked me about and offer some material that you didn't ask me about. Let's start with that stupid plane. Lots of people had a lot of questions about what was going on with that plane. And what I mean by that is the plane that Donald Trump announced that he was going to accept from the Qatari government, which is about a $400 million 747 that is known as a flying palace, and it was royally appointed and so on. And I think it's important to think about that as for what it means in a larger picture. That is, as Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo pointed out, it really is not feasible to think of trying to get a plane like that up and running in time, for Trump to use it, certainly during the time he's in the White House, because, they don't just take a plane and plop the president on it. The president has to be very closely guarded, and the plane has to be very, it's got to have communications and all kinds of security systems and on and all that. And you want that for the president of the United States, regardless of who it is, because of what would happen both in the United States and geopolitically if something happened to the president of the United States. And that's not something that you do in a matter of weeks or even months. That's something you would do in a matter of years. So it certainly looked as if the plane was simply a gift to Donald Trump, because the argument was that it was going to be given to the Air Force, and that's how we get Air Force One. It's an Air Force plane that has the call sign for the president, which is one. So it's not actually a specific plane. I don't know if you know that. It's any Air Force plane that carries the president gets that call sign. And they were going to give it to the Air Force, and then the Air Force was theoretically going to turn it over to Trump's presidential library. And, I don't think Trump quite understands. You don't own what's in your presidential library. The American people own that, and it's managed by the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA. So the idea that he would simply essentially get a plane for his own use after he left the White House, I think was very attractive to him. But rather than thinking about all of a sudden you're going to see this flying palace in the air carrying your president, it's kind of better to think about it as what it symbolizes. Whether it's actually going to happen or not is very much unclear, both because the Qatari government has now backed off and said, well, we are only talking about it with the lawyers, even though Trump had said they were going to do it. And also because the Attorney General Pam Bondi and White House, and one of the top White House lawyers had said, oh yeah, this is fine. He's allowed to do this. Well, in fact, he's not allowed to do this. The Constitution, as you must know if you read me by now, or probably from your own time as a sophomore in high school, you know that the Constitution forbids the US president to take anything of value from a foreign government. What that means in today's day and age is that anything given to the president from a foreign country that is worth more than $480 is considered a present to the American people. And when a president leaves office, except for Trump, it's always happened otherwise, the archivists go through the material that is in the White House. And, there are stories of presidents sort of having to bargain to say, well, that's a picture of my mother with this person. Can that be part of my private, something I own, as opposed to giving it over to the archives? And I'm smiling a little bit, because if you know archivists, they're not pushovers, and they're so this is normally the way gifts are handled. So Attorney General Pam Bondi, as I say, and one of the White House lawyers said, well, it's okay for him to do this. We're signing off on this because it's a gift to the Air Force and then a gift to the presidential library. We're okay with this. But it's really not okay. And it's something that has caused just this firestorm, because while people can't necessarily understand the level of corruption that's happening with cryptocurrency, because crypto is hard to understand, it's pretty easy to say, look, the Qatari government is giving a $400 million plane to the president. And these are the same people who insisted falsely that President Joe Biden had taken $5 million from Ukraine. The person who made that allegation later pled guilty to lying to the FBI. And, they spent 4 years trying to impeach Biden over something that never happened and they had no evidence for. And now they're saying, yeah, $400 million, not a big deal. And that's, again, just the tip of the iceberg in terms of the corruption of this administration. But I think it's really very visible. And it matters in that sense. And it also matters in a different sense. It matters in the sense that if you look at the larger picture, and one of the things I would urge you to do as you're trying to understand what's happening in the world these days is if it's too much and it's too confusing, try and take a step back. And again, sometimes I think of it quite literally as like moving back a level in the onion and keep moving back to see a bigger picture. So if you think, instead of just think about the plane and corruption, who's the plane from? Why does Trump want a good relationship with the Qatari government? And in part, it's because he is making deals in the Middle East, and he's making a number of deals with different leaders in the Middle East to do things like develop property, and they're paying him or the Trump organization literally billions of dollars. And if you look at that relationship between the United States and some of those governments, at the same time, you think about Trump backing away from our traditional partnerships with Europe, for example. You start to see an important realignment. And let me tell you one other thing that has barely been in the news, but it's happening. And you can Google anything I say, you can Google. The Trump administration has said it will not participate in this year's G20. That's the group of 20 nations. And the G20 is a group of, as I say, nations and nations that are grouped with like the European Union and the African Union. But it's a group of all of these countries, or these consortia, if you will. I'm sure there's a real word for it, but I just a second got off a train and I'm a little fuzzy. That together make up about 85% of the world's economic production. So this is a group of really important people and really important countries in terms of managing the world, because that's what they do. It's an intergovernmental forum, and they come and they talk about these issues and they try and figure them out. And so it's a big deal to go to the G20 and to be part of the G20. And of course, the Biden administration insisted that the African Union be admitted to the G20 so that that Africa was no longer sort of being ignored in all this stuff. And there's this real attempt to have these intergovernmental bodies around the world. And the G20 has been very, very important to the United States and to other countries as well. We're not going this year. It's being held in South Africa, and we're not only not going to it, we are no longer even participating in the meetings beforehand. Because every time you see any governmental thing where they have a big event like the G20, it's not like they just show up that day and say, "Oh, hey, George, let's start working." I mean, that stuff goes on for at least a year ahead of time. And there's lots of meetings, there's lots of discussions, lots of negotiations. And by the time they get to the meeting itself, that's the really high level discussions, but there's tons of groundwork done first. We're not participating in that. Instead of us participating in those democratically based organizations that are providing a set of rules for the world to operate on, Trump instead is making a beeline for autocratic governments of wealth. And if you think about the exchange of money and the exchange of the idea of creating these properties, these Trump properties in different Middle Eastern countries and so on, as well as Trump's affinity for people like Vladimir Putin, what you're seeing is a realignment of the power of the United States away from the democracies that we have always participated with, and instead toward monarchies or autocracies that offer sort of exchanges, sort of corrupt exchanges with the leaders of different countries. So something that looks very much more like the world before the Declaration of Independence than the world since World War II. So if you think about that plane and you think about, I don't know if you saw the clips of the parade that Trump was part of in whichever countries, and at the time I think it was Saudi Arabia. It's sort of very pomp and circumstance and princely and monarchy. And, he really likes that a lot. And so when you think about that plane, you should think about the fact it flies accepting a plane like that would fly in the face of the Constitution, the emoluments clause of the Constitution. It's also worth thinking about the symbolism of the President of the United States accepting a $400 million plane from a foreign government with whom Trump clearly is doing business. So that's the way to think about that plane, which is something people ask me about. But that's not everything that I wanted to talk about today. The thing that you did not ask me about, but that is far more important than the plane, is a little bit hard to untangle. So let me just give you some benchmarks for how to untangle it. And that's what the Republicans are calling their, and I swear to God, I'm not making this up, one big, beautiful bill. That is literally how they are describing what is going on right now in the House of Representatives. And what that means is this, and this is why I think it's really confusing, is because normally when the Congress is trying to talk about legislation, it's, as far as I'm concerned, and you don't have to believe this at all, but I really don't like these big omnibus bills we have where Congress can't agree to anything for a year, and then all of a sudden they're like, but we need this, 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 and this, and so we're going to throw it all in a bill, and you have to vote yes, or we're all going to hell in a handbasket. That's really not the way it's supposed to work. But even under those circumstances, when people are talking about one bill or another, they do usually discuss them, and they bring them in at a certain date, and there's debate over them, and there are a bunch of votes, and there's amendments. Usually you can sort of tease out what's in front of you at that particular moment. So if you think back to the Biden administration, for example, he started by saying, I want to have this Build Back Better, and it's going to have everything in it that's going to fix our roads and advance our manufacturing, and it's going to provide childcare and elder care and all this stuff. And that was like right out of the gate. But then Congress broke that in half, and it became the bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the part about childcare and elder care, they just said, no, we're not going to even touch that. And then you had that bill, but then it turned out we needed another bill. So we got CHIPS and Science. And then there was another bill, and that was the Inflation Reduction Act. And that came and went. And then finally it passed. Anyway, it was kind of easy to tease out what was going on. In this case, the Republicans in the House are completely at odds with each other. And what I mean by that is there are the extremist right wing who would like to just slash the government to the bone to get rid of the deficit. And as I've said before, we have the deficit we do because of the George W. Bush tax cuts and the Donald Trump 2017 tax cuts. Think back to Bill Clinton. We had a balanced budget. And we had George W. Bush's tax cuts, and then we had two unfunded wars. And then we had Trump's 2017 tax cuts. But they want to just slash the government to nothing because they want to balance the budget, but they will not raise taxes. And they're the people that are out way far on the right. Those are the Chip Roy, for example. But then there are other Republicans in the House. I'm not going to talk about the Senate probably at all today, but in the House, who are fervent MAGA. They want to stay in office, but they also recognize that those extreme cuts are not popular. Nobody wants those. And so they're trying to fudge that a little bit because the extremists want the cuts. Donald Trump wants the cuts. They're happy with some cuts, but they know they'll never get reelected with all the cuts that are being asked for. And then, of course, there are the Democrats who are like, we're not on board for any of this. All right. So what that has meant is that since the Republicans got into power, actually in the second half of Joe Biden's term, they haven't been able to pass anything. I mean, it is the most do-nothing Congress, the last one in our history, and they're on track to do the exact same thing now. Think of all the laws that they've passed since Trump took office. Oh, whoops, there aren't any, literally. So it's a resolution, and that's about it. So what happened is that Trump wants a bunch of stuff. But it's really not clear how they're going to pass it because there are these, and I just talked about the divisions in the House. The Republicans in the Senate are much less into the whole MAGA thing, although about 13 or 14 of them are MAGA. So they really can't agree on anything. And they've got these razor thin majorities. So if they lose even in the House 3 Republicans, they can't pass anything because the Democrats are going to be like, ain't happening over here, right? So unless it's something the Democrats like, but they're not going to agree to cuts. So what you're seeing right now is Trump has convinced the Republicans in the House to try to pass his entire agenda in one bill. And they're calling it the one big, beautiful bill, because that's what Trump kept calling it. And what this meant was that as soon as the new Congress got sworn in, about 11 committees began to start developing language to put from their committee into that bill for one thing or another that Trump wanted. And most of those committees, about 8 of those committees, they're cuts, basically. People said, you got to cut this, you got to cut that. And they went back into their committee rooms and they figured out how to do that, how to make those cuts. And they said, okay, here you go. And most of us didn't pay a lot of attention because it's not the final bill at all. This is just their piece of that big bill. Well, there were 3 committees that really, really mattered. And they did not actually drop their plans until starting Sunday night. So the 3 committees were the House Ways and Means Committee, and that's the committee where revenue bills start. And so they're the ways and the means. So that's usually the financial stuff. That's the big financial stuff. And so everybody was watching Ways and Means. They were also watching Energy and Commerce. And you're thinking, why? Why are you watching Energy and Commerce? Because weirdly, it's under Energy and Commerce that Medicaid is managed. I actually don't know the history for why Medicaid is there. And then the other one that people were watching was agriculture. And you're like, why agriculture? Because actually the agriculture is one of my favorite committees in the House, because they actually do really cool major stuff because of our weird history around agriculture. But many people don't think that way. So why is everybody watching agriculture? Because in our system, for weird reasons, our supplemental nutrition assistance programs, what we used to call food stamps, are in the Agriculture Committee. That's actually, someday I'll get to write about that. I know why that's the case, and it's actually an interesting story. So they started on Sunday night. Energy and Commerce dropped their plans, and then Ways and Means and Agriculture dropped theirs within the next 24 hours or so. So now all of a sudden people are talking about this great big beautiful bill. I'm sorry, no, it's not. I said that wrong. It's the one big beautiful bill, not the word great, one big beautiful bill. And they're not really talking about the other stuff in it yet, although there's plenty in that other stuff. What they're talking about is what came out of those 3 committees, because those were the ones that were going to be talking about how to manage the finances of the United States in this period in which there's this huge fight, because we have deficits that many people think are unsustainable. There's a big disagreement about that. I happen to be one who's not happy with the deficit at the way it is. The deficit is the amount in a year that we spend but do not have. It doesn't come in revenue. That's not the debt. The debt is the total of all those deficits put together. And a national debt can be extraordinarily useful for a number of things. But in my world, you don't want it to get too high, because borrowing costs then get very expensive. I am not a trained economist, and you can disagree with that. That's where I am on this. But they didn't know how the Republicans were going to try and square this circle, because what Trump wanted more than anything was tax cuts, was to extend his tax cuts, because they are set to expire on December 31st, 2025 of this year. And what he really wants to do is extend those tax cuts. But the problem with extending those tax cuts is that extending them is going to cost the United States about $406 trillion with a T dollars over the next 10 years. It's very difficult to add $4.6 trillion to the deficit and to the debt without, and still argue that you're gonna balance the budget. So one of the things that you keep seeing is promises that there are going to be these giant cuts that are somehow going to materialize. That Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency, they said they were going to cut $2 trillion out of the federal budget, and they ended up at below 150 billion, and even that's not clear. It looks like they might have actually cost us money. So what are you going to do if you want to extend these tax cuts? How are you going to do this? So Ways and Means proposes to extend the tax cuts. So there's $4.6 trillion. And that's a problem because, among other things, by August, we are going to hit the debt ceiling. which is the amount of money that the United States can borrow. And, I keep always explaining the debt ceiling, and maybe you're sick of hearing about it, but just quickie. This comes from our past when the Congress used to actually have debates about how the United States would raise money. And in World War I, they were spending all their time saying, do we want bonds at 3% or bonds at 4%? And and so they just said to the Treasury, raise it however you want, but only to this much. And if you need more than that, come back to us and we'll decide if we should be cutting or if you should borrow more. And we're one of the few countries that does this. Congress still just appropriates money and then the Treasury is supposed to pay it. But if we're spending a lot more than we're taking in, the Treasury keeps hitting those limits that Congress sets. That's the debt ceiling. We're about to hit the debt ceiling in August. We actually already hit it in January, but there are things that the government can do to kind of nurse us along doing things. It's called emergency. It's an emergency setting. And it's things like they don't fund pensions for however long it takes. And they have to make it up later, but we do have a little bit of wiggle room because of that. So we're expected to hit it in August. If we hit it in August, we'll have to default on our debt, which is just an economic disaster, although it's an economic disaster that a number of MAGA Republicans would like to have happen because they have no freaking clue how bad things are going to be if they do that. And I think you can see how little they understand about the economy if you look at how they were, cheering on, for example, all the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency was making or the tariffs and so on. All right, so here's what we got. The Ways and Means Committee said we're going to extend the tax cuts, $4.6 trillion. And even though we scream bloody murder about how much money that the Democrats were spending, even though the deficit went down under Biden, we're going to raise the debt ceiling, $4 trillion. So now all of a sudden we are essentially paying for those tax cuts by borrowing, by saying you're allowed to borrow. But here's where it gets really interesting. That is being accompanied by cuts. And the cuts are all cuts to things that Americans need. So the Energy and Commerce Committee has proposed cuts to Medicaid. After everything Trump said about I'm not going to cut Medicaid and so on, they've proposed pretty significant cuts to Medicaid. And they are arguing that they're not really cutting Medicaid, they're helping Medicaid. But what they're doing, they say, is they're throwing off of Medicaid people who are getting it and shouldn't be, that you have to work in order to be on Medicaid. Which sounds great, except they're once again suggesting that people who are on Medicaid don't work. In fact, I pulled the numbers before I came on here. According to KFF, which is one of our most respected pollsters and medical who do medical stuff, say that 2/3 of the people who are on Medicaid are working. 3 in 10 of the people on Medicaid have caregiving responsibilities, are sick or disabled, or are in school. And that's why they would not be in the workforce. And that only about 8% of people on Medicaid are either retired or are unable to find work or are unable to find work. So what the committee has proposed is, of course, they're saying these are essentially, they're implying they're lazy people. But what they're essentially doing is making it so administratively difficult to get Medicaid that people are going to lose their Medicaid coverage. And estimates right now from the Congressional Budget Office, which is nonpartisan, are that I think it's about 13%, 13 million of the people who are on Medicaid will lose it over the next 10 years if the proposal goes through. That's a big if. So they want to cut that. They also want to cut all of the energy credits and so on under the Inflation Reduction Act of Biden's years, which were helping people to weatherize their homes and help them sort of conserve energy and fuel because it was cheaper. And they want to cut all of those along with some other things that were supposed to address climate change. And finally, they want to significantly cut the SNAP benefits, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Programs, in order to save money to cut money from the budget. So the overall picture here is that the Republican plan in the House of Representatives, and it's very bare bones, and this isn't even the other 8 committees that happened, are that they are trying to dramatically cut the services that Americans need and want. Medicaid is enormously popular. 97% of Americans support Medicaid. I don't think 97% of Americans support anything else, but they support Medicaid. And of course, that includes Republicans in high numbers as well. But they're planning to pay for those cuts for the tax cuts and so on, in part by slashing the things that the rest of us care about and that we need. And that's going to be really important to watch. And it's also worth remembering that this is not a done deal yet. These are the proposals coming out of these committees. And so now I wanted to go here to one of the things I'm hearing a lot that worries me and disturbs me is how many times, especially on social media, I hear from people, why is nobody doing anything? Nobody is speaking up. The Democrats suck. Nobody's standing, and why aren't people in the streets and so on? That is such a misreading of where we are right now, because there is, in fact, enormous pushback against what the Trump administration is trying to do. And I'm going to illustrate how you can tell that in a minute. But I don't just mean that people are in the streets and they're calling their senators and Congress critters, which is enormously important that you're doing. And the reason that you know it's important that you're doing it is because if you think about what's been happening in Congress over these last 2 days, Congress critters are, in the past, they were showing up to do town halls in Republican districts, and AOC and Bernie Sanders have been all over the country. And Chris Murphy is stepping up, and who's a senator from Connecticut. And of course, J.B. Pritzker in Illinois is a governor, and Governor Janet Mills of Maine. All these people are really standing up and starting to push back against the Trump administration. And in the last 2 days in Congress, when they finally brought a bill forward, which they hadn't done in ages, there's screaming matches going on between the Democrats saying you said you weren't going to cut Medicaid and you're cutting Medicaid, and the Republicans trying to say you're lying. We're really not cutting Medicaid. We're getting rid of waste, fraud, and abuse. Well, you need to look at this yourselves and see which one of those things you think is true. But I don't even think. I mean, I know the answer is they're making cuts. They're cutting money and they're cutting accessibility of these programs, which, if you think about of our poorer Americans and the vast majority of our elderly who are in nursing homes, for example, are there because of Medicaid, and our disabled brothers and sisters and so on are getting Medicaid benefits. So, this idea that somehow we can cut that and everything's going to be fine is rather like their plans to cut Social Security accessibility and say it's not going to affect anybody. Well, what they are trying to say is they're not cutting, they're not saying you're off. They're just making sure you can't get on, or it's so difficult that you lose your coverage, and then they can pay less for it. And this is in the cuts, are dramatic cuts, for example, to Medicaid. All right. So Congress people are dramatically pushing back. And why are they pushing back? Because their voters reward them when they push back. Because we call them and we say, would you stand up for something? That pressure is what is giving spines and heart to people like, I'm going to pick on Greg Caesar from Texas, because he's a name that has been more vocal of late, although he's been around, speaking up for a long time, but now he's very much in your face. Jim Himes, I'm sorry. I could keep on listing people off the top of my head, but the point is resistance is working, and it's working not just on the streets and talking at your state level and local level. It is also working actually right now in Congress. It is also working in the courts. Trump is losing in the courts again and again and again and again. That's important. But it's working for 3 big reasons. First of all, because yesterday on the social media channel that used to be known as Twitter, now is known as X, owned by Elon Musk, the House Republicans posted something extraordinary. You can see it. It's still there. They said, we need to get people off the sidelines. And boy, were the responses ballistic from Republicans who were like, what are you talking about? You people have been on vacation now, essentially, you just got off a 4-day vacation. You've been taking all these vacations. You have done nothing in this new Congress. And you're telling us, we elected you. Like we did everything we could to get Trump back in office and to give you majorities, and you've done nothing with it. And of course, the Democrats saying, yeah, you guys are useless. But then also the fact that they felt obliged to post that says that they know they don't have the numbers to pass this extraordinary one big beautiful bill. And the Senate, by the way, the Senate Republicans have already said it's not happening. So you see it in that, but you can also see it in this. You can see it in the attempt of the Republicans to smear Kilmar Abrego Garcia. Trump's big push to win election was that he was going to deport criminals. And, I talked to MAGA people and I was like, he's going after all the immigrants. I'm like, no, he's not. No, he's not. He's only going to go after criminals, rapists and murderers. Well, of course, that's not how it's playing out. These agents, and again, we're not sure who those agents are. Their faces are covered. They're not wearing uniforms. Their names are not showing. They won't give, the names are supposed to show, by the way. And it's not clear to me if these are the same kind of people that Trump nailed together in his first term from the different law enforcement branches of the executive branch, the law enforcement agencies of the executive branch. So, for example, ATF has law enforcement officers that are in the executive branch. Maybe that's who they are. Maybe it's ICE. Maybe he's deputizing people. We don't know because of the fact they're being completely opaque about who these people are. But what we're seeing is these really dramatic and shocking and morally offensive, aside from everything else, images of these masked people grabbing children and mothers, and especially rendering these young deportations. They've taken migrants from Venezuela in the United States and they've sent them to prison in El Salvador without due process. And I mean, even with due process, they shouldn't have gone to El Salvador. They could have gone to Venezuela. They could have gone to prison in the United States. But El Salvador is a wild card here, which is really interesting because there's a longer political argument behind that, which someday I'll tell you about. But the administration admitted they sent Abrego Garcia to El Salvador because of an administrative error. Oopsie poopsie, right? And the judges said, a number of judges, including the Supreme Court, have said, get him back. You can't do that, get him back. And the administration is saying no. They are, and as they do that, Americans who maybe weren't paying close attention are sitting there saying, wait a minute, we don't want to live in a place where the president can say, hey, you're a gang member because you have a tattoo, and we're just sending you to prison. That is literally the definition of an authoritarian government. And for a lot of people for whom due process was the difference between a jail term and not, and I suspect many of you know people like that, as I do, this idea that Trump can just run roughshod over that is not playing well. And you can see it in Joe Rogan's podcast. You can see it in some of the YouTube brothers. You can see it in all of these people with individuals who supported Trump in the election of 2024, but now are like, we're not okay with this. And so in order to push back against that, they're really trying to smear Abrego Garcia. They're calling him a member of MS-13. Take it from me, but you can look this up yourself. There is zero evidence that that man was a member of MS-13. Many reasons to think he was not. There is zero evidence. And you saw Donald Trump thinking that the photoshopped image of his hand, that he literally had MS-13 tattooed on his knuckles. That is simply not the case. And they're trying to smear him. They're papering popular websites and so on with the accusation that he's a gang member, that he's a human trafficker, all of those things. And there's just no evidence for it. And there's a difference, by the way, between somebody being an angel of light, which none of us are. By the way, I got that out of a description of not Billy the Kid, Jesse James. Somebody called Jesse James an angel of light. None of us are angels of light, but there's a difference between saying somebody is an angel of light and saying the government has to prove that that person has committed the crimes you say that person has, which is our due process. You are innocent until proven guilty. And this government is completely turning that on its head. And so you see it in their attempts to smear him because they've lost control of that narrative. So they're now trying to paper everything saying he's terrible when they don't really have that. You also see it in something that I wanted you to be aware of, and that is a new set of ads that the Trump administration is running across the country, trying to convince you that this bill and Trump's tariffs are a really good thing. And there's a lot of lies in it, but there is I think an underlying reality that they know they're in real trouble with this bill, and they're trying to just slam the country with advertising to convince people of something that is not true. So, a lot of people are out there thinking like we're done. We are certainly in the grip of an administration that is trying to destroy our democracy, and it is making good strides to doing that. But there is significant pushback, and you can be part of that pushback. So I wanted to end today with some of the new things out there that I think are really important to do. The first is to push back on this series of ads that are out there right now that are lying about what the Democrats are doing and lying about what the Republicans are doing in order to support Trump. This is, again, something an authoritarian would do. But there are, more than 300 million Americans. We can push back on this, especially on social media. So not only speaking up and writing on social media, but recording short videos of something that is important to you. And because, if everybody who opposes this administration convinces one person, it's a done deal. You don't have to have 6 million followers. You can have 6. That's fine. And videos are very, very effective at doing that. So now is the time absolutely to speak up. And the other thing that I would really urge people to do, and this is something new from me, but is important when you look at how countries reclaim a democracy from an authoritarian government, it's really tempting to always be unhappy about the leader, about Trump. But Trump supporters are really quite wedded to Trump, and that's not really the best way to loosen that allegiance, but rather to highlight the other people in the administration who are not likable. And, you think of the traction that people got against Elon Musk, who was an unelected billionaire. And you think about the reaction that people have had to this airplane. You think about what people would say if they knew about the fact that, Trump just accepted, $5.5 billion for a real estate project in the Middle East. Those sorts of things that say you can love Trump, but maybe you don't really love Kristi Noem, who shot her dog, and who just had a horrible day in a session, or Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is responsible for the deaths of a lot of children in Samoa and now in the United States because he doesn't believe in germ theory, so he doesn't believe in vaccines. This is why he was rolling around in the water that was full of E. coli the other day, is his theory is that germs and bacteria don't matter if your body is strong enough. And that's just, ridiculous. If you look at graveyards from before we had vaccines, they're full of children. And it's not because the children weren't eating their Wheaties. It's because their bacteria and germs are fatal for, in some cases. He doesn't believe that. He thinks you take care of your body. You don't have to worry about whooping cough. You do have to worry about whooping cough. And we've had a lot of deaths. We've had 2 deaths from measles. We've had a number of deaths this year from children who've died from the flu because they weren't vaccinated. And this idea that the flu is not fatal, again, is a misnomer. It is. It can be very, very dangerous. So, instead of aiming at the big guys, the next tier and even below them, Russell Vogt is thoroughly dislikable. But, the different people in the administration are vulnerable in a way that Trump may not be, to criticism and to the very real point that do we want to have a government that works for the very wealthy? And that too is a moment that we're in where people are starting to define what we do want. Pete Buttigieg is out there. AOC is out there talking about what our government should be doing and what we want our government to do. And this is a moment to vocalize those things as well. So I've gone a little bit over, but I am now going to let you go with, I hope, more more hope than you had after the messages I got after last night's letter. Things are not great right now. We didn't want to live through a time like this, but so far we are living through it. And the idea that it's a done deal is simply incorrect. And now is the time. And this summer is going to be rough. But now is the time really to bear down and make your voices heard, because there are so many more of us than there are of them. And we have this extraordinary advantage. Reality is on our side. All right, so with that, I'm going to let you go, and I will do this again tomorrow. I had to miss last night because of the thing with Preet and Joanne, and so I moved that to tonight. But I will again appear normal time on Thursday, and we'll have more questions. So thank you for being here, and I will do a call for questions again tomorrow, and see you then. Thanks for being here. Sue Baird, Tammy King, Durham, North Carolina, sunny DC, PAX. It's lovely down there. It's actually not so sunny here. Greensboro, hi, Liberal Rocks. How are you? Pittsburgh. Oh, what a lovely city Pittsburgh is. I'm a fan of Pittsburgh. I'm a real fan of Pittsburgh. Elaine Benavides, how are you? Super. I'm glad to see so many people here. And it looks like, why is everybody here from North Carolina? It looks like Facebook is here as well now. So let's just get going. And apparently y'all like the shorter versions, which is good. And as I think I said to you before, I will be on the road this week coming up. So I think I've got to adjust. I think maybe not Tuesday, but otherwise, if you're happy with these times, we can keep on doing them. And as I say, once I'm really off the road, I'm going to do a lot more short explainers, among other things. All right. So I wanted to do a quick explainer right now for what happened today in the Supreme Court, because you're going to hear a lot about it. And as usual, it's complicated. So what happened today was that the Supreme Court heard oral arguments in a birthright citizenship case. And I don't spend a lot of time talking about what happens in oral arguments because they're interesting, especially for lawyers, and there are plenty of people with whom you can follow along to say who's saying what and what matters out of the oral discussions. But I'm always interested in how it comes out, because we don't know how it's going to come out until it actually does come out, although often people have guesses. But the reason I wanted to start there today, it's all over the news, is because what's really going on with that case is a lot about the Trump administration. So birthright citizenship is really not contested. It was put into the Constitution. The people in the immediate post-Civil War years believed it was always in the Constitution, which is why they wrote the 14th Amendment the way they did. I will spare you that history right now, but with the 14th Amendment, what that amendment does, if you read it, is it doesn't confer birthright citizenship. It acknowledges birthright citizenship. And that's a deliberate use of words that they put in there to say, hey, it's always been this way. We're just saying that it is here, because they didn't want it to sound as if they were conveying a right that wasn't already in the Constitution. And that's how courts have interpreted it ever since. We always look to the case of Wong Kim Ark, which was 1898, which said, yeah, birthright citizenship is a thing, but it's really pretty established. The reason that the court's hearing today, and the reason that we're looking at this case now, although they will take it up on the merits later, is because the reason the Trump administration wants this case is because they're trying to stop it from being possible for a federal judge in a certain jurisdiction to create an injunction across the nation. That is, I know that was a lot of words, but what that means is that currently when somebody sues the Trump administration over birthright citizenship or over other things, a federal judge can say, we're going to stop the administration from doing this until it moves through the courts. And we actually have a decision about what they can do and what they can't. Now, this has always been the way it is. The Republicans have, during Trump's first term, sent everything through a judge in Texas. You might remember Matthew Kacsmaryk, who did the same sort of thing against policies that during the Biden administration, that the Republicans didn't like. This has been going on. But the reason I'm highlighting it here today is because one of the things that's worth watching with the Trump administration is that they are losing in court. they're losing everywhere in court. And this is why they've made these great attacks on judges and on the judicial system, is because they're trying to make people lose faith in the court. They're trying to destroy that whole legal system. But if you look really closely at the arguments that they make, they are not arguing them on the merits. They are not saying, yes, we have the right to do X, Y, or Z. What they're doing is they're arguing on procedural grounds. This court is not the one that should be looking at this case. Those plaintiffs should not have standing. They're not going to the merits. What they're really trying to do, and this is important, is to gum up the works so that they're obfuscating. They're trying to keep things from being actionable. So a lot of people ask all the time about what's happening with Kilmar Abrego Garcia and why on earth can't they get them back? And what's happening right now is that the court has said that that Abrego Garcia's lawyers have the right now, and they are in the process of trying to figure out who actually rendered the guy to El Salvador. Because there's this big black box. We don't know who did that. And you can't really charge somebody unless you know who did it. So they're trying to do all this obfuscating so that they can continue to do what they're doing, even though they're pretty clearly aware it's against the law. And that's one of the reasons that everyone is so frustrated, is because it's hard to grab hold of who's doing what in this moment. All right, so that's what's going on with that case. And that is, again, I won't really write about it anywhere until there's a decision, because to me, I hate, I don't know about you, I hate it when somebody gives you an article that says this might happen, or this may happen is another word they use a lot. It's like, well, lots of things could happen. I don't have the time to read what might happen. I want to know what did happen. That's my thing. So you won't hear from me about that in writing until we actually have a decision. All right. So I wanted to raise a couple of larger questions today. One of them is that as they are doing with this attempt to be able to keep doing stuff in the shadows, if you will, what the Republican members of Congress and the Republican administration are doing is essentially they're creating an autocrat. They're creating an imperial presidency. They are taking Congress's right to actually legislate away from them. They're attacking the courts. And this is an important point for all the obvious reasons, of course, but I want you to think about something else with it as well. And that's that Trump is not well. He is an older man. I forget if he's 79 now. I think he's about to be 80, right? On the 14th of June. That's why we're having that big parade, that in the military. And he's not okay. So there is, I think, room to push on Republicans who are enabling this to say, if you take away all these safeguards, who are you going to put in there after Trump? You know, their argument, of course, is that Trump has this very loyal voter base, which, by the way, is not loyal any longer. I mean, he's underwater with every constituency except rural Americans, where he's running flat even. They used to be the people who were in favor of him by huge numbers. Now they're at 50-50. It's actually 45-45. 10% aren't paying attention. But that's a real problem, because if they get rid of all the safeguards, they get rid of Congress's power, they get rid of the court's power, and then they give all this power to Trump. And we know that Trump is not actually the one wielding that power right now, because it's pretty clearly Stephen Miller, Russell Vought, and it used to be Elon Musk. That would be the anti-immigrant people, the Project 2025 people, and the tech bros. And now we know that Russell Vought was doing a lot of the work that Elon Musk was doing with the Department of Government Efficiency. Russell Vought was kind of the sidekick there. Who are they planning to put in there, and what does that look like? So if you are a Republican senator, you know, you might say, okay, yeah, I can't challenge Trump, but do you really want to give that much power to J.D. Vance? And the answer to that is no. J.D. Vance does not have an independent group of supporters. Nobody likes him. He's pissed off two popes. I mean, that's, it's a little hard to do. So I think that's going to be a really important thing going forward in terms of resisting this imperial presidency or this autocracy, is that there isn't a successor here. to Trump. And the potential successors that there are cannot command the kind of loyalty that many senators can. So if you think of any of the options of people to put in there, you think of one of Trump's kids, for example, which is how an autocrat would work, or you think of J.D. Vance, or you think of Elon Musk, or you think of Russell Vogt. You think of all these people, none of them can command the kind of support that, say, Ron Johnson can in Wisconsin, who has his own base of support, or Lisa Murkowski in Alaska, or even Susan Collins in Maine, or any of the Republican senators who do have people who are going to vote for them on a regular basis just because of who they are and because it's the name they're used to. Whoever is going to replace Trump can't do that. And that is going to be an important wedge going forward. All right. So I wanted to talk too a little bit about the fact that this imperial presidency is designed to put in place Trump's agenda, not necessarily the business agenda of the majority of the Republican, what I would call Republican oligarchs, certainly not the American people. It's designed to put Trump's agenda in power. And that's really important. And I think you can see this right now with the gift of the Qatari jet, which apparently is sitting in Texas right now, waiting for Trump to take possession of it, whether or not he will. Turns out to be quite an old plane, and it will never be able to be operational as Air Force One. So basically, it's a plane for him after he leaves office. Maybe it's encouragement to leave office. Who knows? Anyway, this trip that he made to the Middle East was explicitly about doing business deals with Middle Eastern governments, very wealthy Middle Eastern governments. And I'm going to sort of do a side comment here. This is a real problem for Israel. It does not have the kind of money that the Arab states do. And they've made a lot of calculations based on the concept that Trump was always going to be loyal to Benjamin Netanyahu. And now Trump's just like, show me the money, baby. And that's going to be a problem in foreign affairs. But in terms of America, I mean, literally a problem in the sense of an issue in foreign affairs. But literally, he is doing business. He is there to do business, which is not the grounds on which American foreign policy has ever operated. Not ever. It has never operated on that. The closest you could get to it would be somebody like maybe Teddy Roosevelt, but also William Howard Taft. But that was not the driving force behind their foreign policy at all. And we just haven't done that before. What you're seeing is a pre-democratic system of a bunch of autocratic or monarchical leaders essentially giving gifts to each other and deciding that if they get lots of the marbles, they're going to be able to order the world the way that they want. And you see it in the kind of autocrats that Trump likes. He likes hanging out with Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia. He likes hanging out with Vladimir Putin. He likes that idea that he's gold-plated and a king. But while in the United States, there are many reasons, of course, to disagree with that in terms of our concepts of political power, and I talk about those all the time. What I haven't ever really talked about, and that I think is important here in this moment, is what it means for economic power. Because and hang on with me for a minute. I know it's 6:15 on a Thursday night, but economic power and the construction of an economy is intimately tied to political power. And what I mean by that is this: if you want to have a country that is based in a very small group of rich leaders, oligarchs, or a dictator, but and the oligarchs around that dictator, you essentially need to make your money through extractive resources. That is, you need to have a lot of workers who are very easily exchanged. I don't like to call them unskilled because I don't really believe there is such a thing as unskilled labor. This is a big thing when I teach, and they talk about unskilled labor like farming, and I always say, quick, tell me what common New England plant is fatal to sheep. And of course, the answer is milkweed, but nobody knows that any longer. And that's something you have to know in order to be a farmer, which is an unskilled position. Similarly, if you ever tried to make anything, if you're a blacksmith, and have you ever tried to cook in a wood stove? those are things that the people I grew up with, some of them could literally put their hand in a wood stove, their arm in a wood stove, and tell you what the temperature was. I could no more do that than I could fly. And I'm a pretty good cook. So I don't like the idea of unskilled labor. But if you're going to have an economy centered around a very few, very wealthy people, it usually is extractive. And by that, I mean mining. Basic agriculture, so that you need people to harvest cotton, for example, oil, these very profitable extractive industries, timber. Again, that's not an unskilled. Cutting down trees is so not unskilled, but the idea here is your people are somewhat interchangeable. There are a lot of them. They don't make a lot of money, and because they don't make a lot of money, you don't actually have to give them any political power. They don't have the power to require you to give them give them some political say in the way the country works, because you don't need their tax money. You don't really need them to lend you money. They're really kind of not that important in the economic scheme. You can see this in the United States, in the American South before the Civil War, where a very few people had all the money, and the African American enslaved people did all the work. And you can see it in mining in the American West. You can in the same period, you can see it in the rise of agribusiness in the late 19th century, which, by the way, always depended on migrant labor. It has always depended on migrant labor. It was built to be that way, and to be built on cheap migrant labor. That's a really interesting story itself. So if that's the case, if you want to concentrate that power and that wealth, you want to have a bunch of people who are interchangeable, don't have a lot of power, don't have a lot of money, maybe you're not terribly healthy. You want to have a lot of little worker bees. But what you don't want to have is people who are neither at the very top nor at the very bottom. You don't want the middle class. And the reason you don't want the middle class, and I'm going to divide that in two groups, is because if you have an economy in which you are running factories, for example, that's really, it's not easy to run a factory. You have to have skills. You have to understand what you're doing. You need to have enough skills and enough people in the realm there that to be able to do those skills that they can keep a factory running. It's not easy to. I mean, what do you do when all of a sudden you lose some of your market, or there's a flood, or you need to have actual people who know what they're doing there. But here's the problem. If you have people who actually know what they're doing in a factory, for example, or financial industry or whatever, I'm thinking sort of the middle class there, the upper middle class, they're going to want decent salaries, and they're going to have the power to get it because they're also going to because they're valuable, and because they're going to want political power. And you don't really want to give them the political power because they're going to look at you and say, wait a minute here, dude, what are you doing taking a plane from Qatar? Or what do we want some of what you've got. But here's the other piece. And I think you see this right now with the Trump administration, the degree to which they're cutting the United States Postal Service and all the other pieces of the federal government that were legs up for Americans, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, to join that group of people I'm talking about. Those jobs are, and that's especially Black Americans, those jobs are being slashed right and left, unconstitutionally, but they're getting rid of those people. But here's who you really don't want. You don't want researchers and entrepreneurs, because they could have the next great idea and they're really smart. So they're going to be well educated. So they're going to demand money, and they're going to demand political power. So if you look at the cuts that the Trump administration is making, what we very well could be seeing is a deliberate attempt, not just for Trump to gather all the goodies into his own pockets, but to get rid of an economy that enables the rest of us to get education, to have access to resources, including healthcare, for example, and to be able to prosper in our society in such a way that we will ask for money. We want salaries. We'll ask for benefits, which cost money, and we will demand political power. So the cuts that the Department of Government Efficiency has been making, which are enormously unpopular, the administration is trying to say it's about waste, fraud, and abuse, and that's simply not the case. I mean, they're not actually going after the things that are expensive. What they are doing is they are destroying those two middle groups of an economy that could challenge the ability of an autocrat or a group of oligarchs to gather power amongst themselves. And that's, it's kind of a macro look at the economy, but it's going to be really important, I think, and is very important, because I think we're losing that group of people quite deliberately, not entirely. I mean, that's just the federal government side of it. But the federal government has traditionally been where veterans, people of color, women, and so on could work their way into that middle group. And that's an important piece of this, I think, as well. All right, so how are they doing that? They're doing it largely through threats. What the administration is doing is incredibly unpopular. I've told you he's underwater with every demographic on every issue, except rural voters, and they're 45-45. They're dead even. And as many people have been pointing out in the last 2 days, the cuts that the Republicans are talking about to Medicaid, for example, to SNAP benefits, what used to be called food stamps, to the different pieces that were in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, those are going to hit Republican counties, which is how you really look at this, not Republican-dominated states, but at a county level. That's going to hurt Republican counties far more than it's going to hurt Democratic counties. So the question is, will rural voters stay with Trump despite all that? And I have to say, I think the answer to that you can see in the administration's desperate pushback to try and smear Kilmar Abrego Garcia as a member of a gang. There's no evidence that he was a member of a gang. There's certainly no evidence he was a human trafficker. I mean, that's just lies. So you see this as well in the attempts of unmarked, masked, apparently officials. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, some great conspiracy here, but everybody makes assumptions based on what we expect. And I keep seeing people talking about, well, these ICE agents came and got these people. And I'm like, how do you know they're ICE agents? I mean, they're not, their faces are covered. Their names aren't visible. We don't know who they are. And of course, Trump did this in his first term. If you remember that very famous photograph of all those officers standing on the Lincoln Memorial, the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, we later found out that those people came from the different law enforcement pieces of the executive branch. ATF, for example, there's a bunch of law enforcement organizations that are within the executive branch, and he just used those in that case. That could be what's happening now. We don't have any idea because we have not been told. And it's always a mistake to make assumptions based on what you and I assume. I mean, that whole Felix Unger thing, it makes an ass out of you and me, right? We don't know that they're ICE until we have evidence that they're ICE. We're making assumptions and we shouldn't. Anyway, I think Trump is really, and his people, and by the way, I don't actually think it's Trump behind the immigration stuff. I think it's Stephen Miller and Kristi Noem. Stephen Miller being the deputy White House chief of staff and Kristi Noem being the Secretary of Homeland Security. But they're really trying to terrorize people. And that's the point. They're arresting and interrogating people who are here legally. They're doing the same to American citizens. They're doing it to anybody they can get their hands on because it makes people frightened and they're hoping they're going to shut people up. But here's a statistic for you. Trump is deporting fewer people per day than Joe Biden did. This is largely for show. Because there were many systemic reasons that immigration skyrocketed during Biden's term, in part because the economy was so good that countries in Latin America that had taken in workers before the pandemic sort of squeezed them out after the pandemic when inflation was incredibly high and the economies weren't recovering. What economy was recovering better than any other in the world? The US, which is why so many people were trying to flood in. And we had a desperate need for workers, still do, by the way. But that meant there were many more people trying to come in under Biden. That is no longer the case, in part because our economy is suddenly collapsing, not fully collapsing, but it's shrinking. And of course, in part because of this system of terrorism. But the other piece of this that I really want people to pay attention to is the fact that the Trump administration and the Trump people are concerned enough about how unpopular all this is that they have launched a media blitz. You're seeing ads on TV that are funded by political action committee that's began, or an organization that began during the 2024 election campaign. It's very well funded. It's got more than $500 million, but you're also seeing it in a real uptick on social media of people telling us that it's not worth fighting back, that the democracy is lost, sucks to be you, all this kind of stuff. That is a deliberate attempt to undermine the idea that Trump is unpopular and this agenda is really falling apart. And that's going to be really important to pay attention to and answering to. And I'm going to get to that in just a second. So when I talk about pushing back, the other thing that you are seeing everywhere in social media right now is nobody's doing anything. Why is nobody doing anything? And I'm sitting here as a historian going, what are you talking about? So I think partly Americans want everything to change today. I mean, we're used to pretty much instant gratification. But in fact, the pushback has been enormous. And you can see that the pushback is enormous by the fact that the Trump people feel that they've got to start advertising now. You know, we're only 100 days or 100 and whatever it is days, figures into ad buys. That's not a good sign. If you remember, he's supposed to have a mandate. He's already having to advertise in these huge blitzes to try and convince people to get behind what he's doing and to terrorize people at the same time. So where are we seeing pushback today? I think you're seeing pushback in Congress, because remember, everyone's like, where are the Congress people? Well, Congress hasn't done anything now forever. They've been, the Republicans have not put anything forward because they cannot agree on anything. So now that there's actually something on the table, this one big, beautiful bill that Trump is trying to push through, the Democrats are all over the people who are coming in to testify. And yesterday and the day before, say Thursday, Tuesday and Wednesday, the pushback against people like Secretary of Homeland Security, Kristi Noem, was extraordinary. And she looked terrible. I mean, she wouldn't answer a question. She just stood there and lied. It was not good. And nor was the appearance of Secretary of Health and Human Services, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in both the House and the Senate, where he literally did not know some of the programs that were in his wheelhouse. And he also insisted that he was not cutting personnel and he was not cutting programs. They've cut more than 20,000 people, and they've cut more than $2.7 billion from the National Institutes of Health. Either he's lying or he has no clue what's happening on his watch. So that increasing pushback from the Democrats is very important in Congress, but you're also seeing it all over the country. And I want to emphasize this because this is also a big fight. The mainstream media is already talking about the election of 2028. Who's going to run? Everything's about who's going to run, which kind of makes me crazy. Because at this point, we have to assume that everybody is running and that nobody is running. You know, the point of being in politics is that you're out there talking. Unless somebody says, I am absolutely not running, which like Mrs. Obama, for example, and she's held to that, you have to assume that everybody's running. Which is fine. Who cares? What they're really out there doing is they're trying to test the waters and to see what messages resonate and to hear what people are talking about. Pete Buttigieg is great on this, but he's not the only one. I mean, there's at least 8 people off the top of my head that I can say that are doing this. We want that because what they're doing is they are the complaints of people like us funnel up to people like that. And they start to talk to each other, and one of them looks in the other and says, boy, he got a lot of attention for saying that. I'll say the same thing. And as this plays out over the next year or so, certain people will flame out, certain people will change what they're talking about. But what we are doing is we're working toward a new way to look at what we want out of our government. And I just have to add here, I am incredibly sick of hearing about how the Democrats are in disarray. What the problem for the Democrats is that the mainstream media and the Democrats themselves have permitted the Republicans to define them. So that, this whole idea that Democrats are falling apart. No, they're not, and they're, that, they lost this last election. There's a number of reasons they lost the last election. But one of the key problems that the Democrats have is that the Republicans have tilted the playing field so fully in their own direction. It's extremely hard for Democrats to win. And this is gerrymandering and voter suppression. And of course, the way the Electoral College is set up. So you're seeing, if you will, a new set of people embracing democratic ideas, but they're not changing that tune altogether so much as, I hope, being much more aggressive about the things that it seems to me are extraordinarily popular, like common sense gun safety legislation. I always go to that first, simply because we know that more than 80% of Americans, and that includes Republicans and independents as well as Democrats, want common sense gun safety legislation. So it is not radical to say, hey, I'm for background checks. That's a popular position to take. So we're already seeing, the field for 2028 is open. Of course it's open. But who is going to be, it's way too early for anybody to pick a favorite, in the sense that we want all those voices in there. We want them arguing. We want them speaking to different places. And then we want them to come together later on. But before we get there, we've got school board races and state races and all sorts of places where we have plenty of energy to worry about elections there. This is a mainstream media thing, and it comes from a weird place in our history. It comes from the 1960s, and it's so time for us to get away from that, because what we're seeing in this moment is the American people really stepping back up to drive our politics. That's a hell of a story. And that we're really not seeing reflected in the mainstream media. We're seeing it reflected in the independent media. And that's really the main story here. So if that's the case, how do you take a moment of rising authoritarianism and push back on it? And Americans, again, many people are like, well, this has never happened before, to which historians will say, of course it has in the United States. Look at the American South from 1874 to 1965, in which we had a world that looks very much like it feels that the Trump Republicans are trying to impose on the nation as a whole. Very few white guys had everything. And even though they held elections, we always knew the Democrats were going to win. And even if you were a white guy or a white woman, that didn't mean you had equal rights before the law, because you might not get along with whoever's in power and they would come down on you and not on their own kids or whatever. And if you were black or brown or an indigenous American, you were SOL, right? We've done this. And we ended up where we were in the 1960s. How did we get there? We got there when ordinary Americans started putting sunlight on the ways in which our fundamental principles were being perverted by a few people who were trying to grab control of all the money and all the power. And that starts, of course, in the 19th century, but it really takes off with W.E.B. Du Bois when he starts to edit The Crisis, which was the magazine of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. But he's not the only one. He's really the one who highlights attacks on Black Americans. But you also have the muckrakers. You have people who are really looking and saying, hey, wait a minute, the Minneapolis government is corrupt and here's how. Or Standard Oil is taking over the oil industry and here's why that's a bad thing. And we're seeing that now. We're getting that. But key to that is for ordinary Americans to spread that information and to push back against the lies. To say, wait a minute, I am not okay with the president taking a $400 million bribe from the Qatari government. I'm just not. And I'm not okay with the president taking bribes through his cryptocurrency. And I'm not okay with the slashing of our National Weather Service or whatever your issue is. Speaking up, because what needs to happen to change the ship of state is for ordinary people to begin to flood the zone with principles and with examples of how those principles are being broken. Now, one of the ways that you can do that is not only the way I always talk about through words, art. Art is enormously popular. If you are an artist and it's very eye-catching, if you're an artist, knock yourself out. Just bring color and joy and principle back to the public sphere in whatever way you possibly can. That is all a form of, as I say, changing the ship of state. What does that look like? It does not look like impeaching Donald Trump tomorrow. That's never going to go through right now because the Republicans are never going to let it go through. And they want that fight right now. It goes through, it makes a difference by convincing electeds, that is people we elect to office, that they should be more afraid of angry voters than they should be of the MAGA Republicans. And you're already seeing this. You're seeing people like Ron Johnson has backed away from the one big beautiful bill. Ron Johnson could not be more MAGA. And you're seeing this in a number of places where now Donald Trump says he's not going to try and put the Department of Government Efficiency cuts into play for at least 2 more years. You can see people backing off because of popular voices. And the trick there is not to back off from that. So one of the things we have seen is that when people were paying attention really on a day-to-day basis to what had happened to Kilmar Abrego Garcia and so many of the other young men rendered to El Salvador, Trump's popularity tanked, especially over immigration. As people backed off from that, his popularity started to tick up again. So that constant, can you believe this is happening thing matters. It really does matter. Because at the end of the day, as we do that and as we pull together in organizations, politicians really do listen to those changes. So I urge people not to be despairing. I feel, it's not good. It's not good where we are, but it's also not over yet. And a lot of the future, I'm always talking about how we can't change the past, but we can change the future. And to that I hold and will always hold, because until it's happened, it's not written in stone yet. And we are not at a place yet where anything is written in stone. And so much of what you see on social media about how it's all over and it's terrible and we're done, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, and we are not there yet. So that was, I think, about all I wanted to cover tonight. I went over again. I'll get better at the 30-minute thing. Thank you for being here, and I'll let you know about next week's schedule, and we'll figure this out over the course of the summer. I am not traveling this summer. So thank you for being here, and I'll see you again soon.